I can't think of any other reason than belief in something like that that could possibly justify what's happening. So I'm trying to look for alternative explanations, So, okay, the Liberal government has decided to implement a state of emergency. Okay, so here's a psychological explanation. Trudeau's father did that back in the 1970s, and Justin is constantly trying to prove his validity as a figure of masculine integrity. And I think there's probably some of that going on, because if there wasn't, he wouldn't have run for prime minister to begin with, because he's so supremely unqualified to be prime minister that it's a complete bloody miracle that anyone can be narcissistic enough to assume that with that little knowledge, a role like that should be adopted. So that's definitely a factor. And so he's got to stand up and show that he can do it under duress. And then it's got to be the belief that there's something like a far-right conspiracy occurring, because invoking the Martial Law Act, the Emergency Act, is so preposterous a move that unless you actually believe that there was a signal threat of that paranoid sort, there's no way you could justify it strategically, because I cannot see how anyone could think through, including Chrystia Freeland, by the way, the notion that this is going to go over well over a period of something approximating a month. And I read the other day that because FinTrack never found any evidence of radical foreigners colluding in a right-wing manner to fund the Freedom Convoy, that most of the information that the government depended on was actually generated by the CBC. And so then we have this feedback loop, right? Well, there's that, yeah, and that's a whole other bloody insane catastrophe, that funding site was hacked by a crazy activist, and then that information was distributed, and that distribution of stolen information is technically illegal, and the media jumped on that, and the government capitalized on it. And it's got to be that they believe their own press. And that's so interesting, because they bought the press and paid them to tell them what they wanted to hear, and now they believe it and justify their policy as a consequence of that. Canadians have to think this through. So we had martial law imposed. It's supposed to be debated in Parliament, and then we have to talk about the fact that there's been no Parliament for 2 years. It's supposed to be debated in Parliament. On the very day that the debate is supposed to start, the government announces that it's going to suspend Parliament yet again, not because of COVID, but because of the dangers of the situation they created to stop debate about that very measure. And everyone went along with it. It is not clear at all that there's any rationale whatsoever that's credible constitutionally or politically for the suspension of Parliament itself during the time of the COVID crisis. Because Parliament is the place where the voice of the people meets the voice of the leaders, and where the political thought that guides the country originates. And so even though we had essential services that stayed open during the COVID epidemic, Parliament wasn't deemed one of them. So Parliament is now not an essential service. Okay, so now we've been trained in some sense, or become accustomed to the fact that government can occur in this country in the absence of Parliament.